My daughter collapsed in her kitchen. Her husband called me shaking. "She's asking for you," he pleaded. "You're still her emergency contact." I stared at the phone and said, "She changed that months ago." At the hospital they asked, "Relation to patient?" I answered, calm as glass, "I'm the mother she downgraded." Then I declined to sign and walked out before they called me mom again. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. I only needed her to check if I landed. She labeled me emergency only. The descent into Raleigh was smooth, uneventful, just as it had always been when Margaret visited her daughter. She watched the city roll into view below the clouds, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the way they had always done when holding a client's file before court. 62 years old and semi-retired, she had spent her career defending strangers with more attention than her own daughter now gave her. When the wheels touched down, she powered on her phone and typed the same text she always did after a trip, no matter how short. "Landed safe. Hope your meeting went well. XO, Mom." She sent it and didn't expect a reply right away. Claire was busy. Claire was always busy. The kind of busy that made everything feel urgent, except the presence of her own mother. By the time the rideshare dropped her at Claire's house in the suburbs, the text remained unread. Margaret looked up at the sleek gray facade with its magazine-perfect symmetry. It was the kind of house you couldn't tell apart from the others on the block, just slightly better landscaped. The door opened as she stepped onto the porch. "Oh, good, you're here," Claire said, waving her phone in one hand while balancing a coffee in the other. Her voice was pleasant, not warm. "Sorry, I've been slammed today." "It's fine," Margaret replied, smiling faintly. "I know how these weeks can get." She didn't mention the text. The next few days moved with the mechanical rhythm of a family that had edited itself into a performance. Dinners were polite. Conversations skated across the surface. Her grandson, Ethan, was sweet and distracted. Claire flitted in and out of rooms with curated energy, offering smiles without invitation. Margaret felt like a decorative object, set out for a few days, then quietly stored. On Thursday, while looking for an old colleague's number, Margaret realized she'd left her phone in the rental car. Claire, curled up on the couch scrolling through emails, handed hers over. "Here, use mine. Just don't judge the chaos." Margaret smiled, took the phone, and opened the Contacts app. Her fingers froze. There, under E, was her name. Emergency only. Not mom, not mother. Just 2 words and no identity. The kind of label you assign a dentist, a landlord, a system failsafe. She said, "Nothing," made her call as planned, handed the phone back with a nod of thanks. Claire didn't look up from her screen. That evening, after the awkward rhythm of a dinner where no one asked about her trip, Margaret packed her things and drove the hour back to her own home in Durham. The moment she walked through the door, the stillness of her own space wrapped around her like a better kind of silence. She made tea, chamomile with a twist of orange, and stood at the window while the kettle hissed behind her. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply moved to her office, opened the file drawer on the right-hand side, and pulled out the estate folder labeled Clare-Co-Access. The computer glowed gently in the darkened room as she clicked open the digital record. She moved the cursor over the file name. Then slowly, precisely, she renamed it Clare, Emergency Access Only. She saved the change, closed the file, then reached into her top drawer and pulled out a small envelope, the kind that once held handwritten notes and now served quieter, colder purposes. Inside was a spare house key. Claire's. Given with love. Once. Margaret slid a folded slip of paper into the envelope and wrote in blue ink, "Void upon disrespect." She sealed it and placed it at the back of the filing cabinet, behind the health proxy and the insurance records. Then she went upstairs, poured the tea, and opened a book. The house was quiet. She places Claire's spare house key into a sealed envelope labeled "Void upon disrespect." She didn't ignore me by accident. She curated it. The silence didn't feel accidental anymore. It used to be a lapse. Missed calls, delayed replies, quick sorries that felt vaguely sincere. But lately, Margaret noticed the silence between them had become a structure, not a mistake. It was deliberate, maintained, like someone pruning a garden to keep out the original roots. Clare hadn't called since Margaret left Raleigh, not to ask if she got home safely, not to say thank you, not even to comment on the weather, which they used to treat like a bridge on hard days. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Margaret resisted the impulse to reach out again. She didn't need more one-sided proof. The group chat, once a stream of photos and inside jokes between Clare, her father, and a few cousins, had shifted in tone. Margaret's messages, when she sent them, were met with polite indifference. Nice? Or sounds fun, from Clare, the digital equivalent of a head nod while walking away. Her ex-husband Robert still sent emojis and exclamation points, but they felt hollow now, like someone whistling through an empty hallway. One Saturday morning, while reorganizing her pantry, Margaret overheard a local segment on the radio. Live tonight at the downtown recital hall, the Triangle Youth Ensemble's spring performance. Her breath caught briefly. Ethan played piano. She remembered him practicing Claire de Lune when she visited. No one had mentioned a recital, no invite, no text. She didn't ask why. That evening, she dressed in navy and wore her hair down. No makeup, no perfume, just a coat against the March chill and gloves that helped her feel less visible. She didn't go inside. She parked 2 blocks away and walked to the far corner across from the entrance. The crowd was dressed well. Satin skirts, wool coats, collared shirts on young boys tugged at by distracted mothers. Claire stood on the front steps, laughing. Robert beside her. Claire's husband, Alex, stood confidently in a blazer, shaking hands with someone Margaret didn't recognize. They looked like a picture, whole, framed, and finished. Margaret didn't cry. She turned away and walked 3 blocks east until she reached a small, independent bookstore she hadn't visited in years. The bell above the door chimed gently as she stepped inside. It smelled like old wood, cinnamon tea, and aged paper. She drifted past shelves until she found the journals, plain, cloth-bound, with no lines. She chose the slate gray one. At home, the house felt too quiet. She made chamomile and sat down at the dining table. The journal opened in front of her. Her pen touched the page and didn't hesitate. Silence is sometimes a scream. Today, it screamed. She closed the book gently. There was no rage in her, only a new kind of resolve. One that had nothing to do with confrontation and everything to do with clarity. She opened her digital calendar, scrolled forward 2 months and a week, typed, 72 days from now, asset split trigger. She didn't define it further. Not yet. The next afternoon, her phone buzzed as she was repotting the rosemary on her back patio. A single text from Claire lit up the screen. Hey, can I keep using your garage for storage a bit longer? Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, set the phone down, and stared at the sunlight as it filtered through the bare branches above her. The air smelled like soil and the start of spring. She didn't answer right away. Claire texts, Hey, can keep using your garage for storage a bit longer? They stored their junk in my garage. I stored my decision right beside it. Margaret stood at the edge of the garage, sleeves rolled, hair pulled back, staring at the collection of boxes labeled in Claire's handwriting, seasonal, baby stuff, misc, as if her home had quietly become a rental storage unit. The smell hit first, not moldy but musty, like paper left too long in a humid attic. Dust shimmered in the slanted afternoon light, catching on old toys, cracked bins, and a chair Claire had once said she'd refinish someday. Margaret stepped over a half-collapsed wardrobe box and opened the side door for airflow. She hadn't replied to the text, not in words. Instead, she spent the morning clearing space, not throwing anything away yet, but creating distance. She moved their things to the far corner of the garage, stacking them neatly but deliberately behind an old shelving unit and a folded ping-pong table no one had touched in 10 years. She stared at the keypad mounted beside the interior garage door. Her fingers moved before she fully decided. 6 digits, Claire's birthday. She erased it. She entered a new code, something random, something private. She tested it twice. The motorized hum of the door shifting in response was oddly satisfying. She didn't tell anyone. Back inside, she dusted off a manila folder from her office marked Title-Property Joint. She laid it flat on the table and read through the deed, the signatures. It had felt generous at the time, an investment in Claire's future, a shared stake in something solid. They were listed as joint tenants with rights of survivorship, a legal bond forged in optimism. Now, that clause read like a tether. She made a call. At her lawyer's office later that week, Margaret sat upright in a navy wool coat that matched the precise language she intended to speak. The lobby smelled of lemon oil and photocopier heat. Her lawyer, Daniel, greeted her with a tone that implied he'd already sensed the purpose behind her visit. Margaret placed the deed on the desk between them. "I want to explore options." Daniel flipped through it, glasses perched low on his nose. "You still co-own the duplex, correct?" "Correct," she said, "but the emotional tenancy has ended." Daniel gave a short laugh, then nodded. "What exactly are you hoping to change?" "Boundaries," she said. "I want to separate our ownership, make it distinct, no automatic survivorship, and I want my half secured against access. I don't want her walking in just because she knows the code or the neighborhood thinks she still can." Daniel leaned back. "There's no legal reason she needs access to your portion, not unless you give it." Margaret folded her hands over the edge of her handbag. "Then let's get architectural about boundaries." He smiled again, smaller this time, and opened a new folder. Later that night, Margaret returned home to the sound of wind tapping against the window panes. She boiled water for tea, opened her journal, and noted the day's shift in one line. "Today I changed the locks no one else could see." She tucked the journal away and flipped through the day's mail. Mixed in with the grocery circulars and a flyer for gutter cleaning was a sleek, matte newsletter. No envelope, just the bold title printed in silver across the front. "Estate Design for the Disengaged." She turned it over. No return address. Just a QR code and the tagline, "You don't owe them access. You design it." Margaret held the paper in her hands for a long moment. Then she set it beside her tea, opened her laptop, and clicked on the trust folder she'd begun to sketch out weeks ago. Nothing concrete, just ideas. Tonight, it would become structure. She receives a newsletter. "Estate Design for the Disengaged." We shared the deed, not the respect. The legal language was cold, clinical, without malice. And yet, as Margaret reviewed the paperwork one final time before signing, she felt something click into place deep inside her chest. Not triumph, not guilt, just precision, like a bone realigned after months of quiet dislocation. The morning was overcast, and the filtered light through her study window made the documents glow faintly on the desk. Her pen hovered for a second before touching down, tracing her name in confident, upright strokes. The motion felt familiar, deliberate, necessary. She was severing the joint tenancy. Not selling, not evicting. Simply converting their legal arrangement into something more honest. Partitioned ownership. What had once been framed as a symbol of shared future was now a divided property. Her half, Claire's half, independent. Distinct. She scanned the confirmation email from Daniel. Notice of partition filed. County recorder updated. It was done. 2 days later, Clare responded, of course not with a call, but a text. It arrived while Margaret was steeping her second cup of Earl Grey. "Clare, why are you doing this?" No greeting. No punctuation. The lack of question mark didn't soften it. If anything, it made it feel more like a suspicion than a question. Margaret stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back, "Margaret, it's just good planning." She set the phone down and didn't check it again until that evening. When she did, there was a new message, not from Clare, but from her husband, Alex. "Alex, this is so unlike you. We're all trying to move forward and you're making things unnecessarily tense." Margaret read it once, calmly. The tone was the same as always, aloof, performative empathy covering entitlement. The implication was clear. She was overreacting, disrupting harmony. A disruption, as if respect had ever been evenly distributed. She didn't respond. She forwarded the message to Daniel with a short note. "Please file this for record. I'm also done receiving texts from him. Then she blocked Alex's number. She breathed out slowly, the kind of exhale that came not from relief, but from readiness. That night, she made a call to the contractor who had remodeled her sunroom 5 years earlier. He remembered her, still had her notes saved. "I'm looking for a new lock system," Margaret said, her voice measured. "Something custom, secure, separate entries for Unit A and Unit B, remote override, access logs, backup generator. I don't want key fobs, I want codes, and I want them to expire." There was a pause on the other end. "Planning for Airbnb tenants?" he asked, light-hearted. She smiled faintly, her voice quiet but firm. "Something like that." They scheduled a site visit for Tuesday. By then, the clouds had cleared and the afternoon sun returned. Margaret spent part of the day in the garden, trimming back overgrowth and clearing out dead roots from her flower beds. The metaphor was unmissable, but she let it sit in silence. Later, she noticed a blinking light on her landline phone. A voicemail. Few people use that number anymore. Her fingers hesitated before pressing play. Claire's voice was small, almost unsure. "Mom, I don't know what's happening. I mean, I do, but I don't know what I did to deserve this. Do you even love us anymore?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was dense, brimming with unsaid truths and too many years of emotional shortcuts. Margaret didn't delete the message. She didn't respond either. She closed the door to her study, placed the final contractor specs into her estate file, and pulled up a blank page in her journal. She titled the entry, "Conditional Access Begins with Clarity." Claire leaves a voicemail. "Do you even love us anymore?" She labeled me emergency only, so I gave her a code that only works in emergencies. The keypad blinked red the first time Claire tried it. 3 seconds, a pause, another attempt, another red light. Outside the garage door, Claire stood frowning beneath an overcast sky, clutching her phone in one hand and a duffel bag in the other. She was dressed for convenience, leggings, a thermal hoodie, her hair swept up carelessly in a clip that used to mean comfort, but now suggested irritation. Inside, Margaret watched the access log refresh from her desktop screen. Code attempt, invalid. Time stamped, GPS confirmed. The security system responded with a short buzz and a message on the screen. Access denied. Unrecognized code. Margaret closed the tab and took another sip of tea, jasmine with honey, still steaming in her favorite ceramic mug. She didn't look out the window. She didn't need to. 3 days earlier, the new smart lock system had been installed. It wasn't extravagant, just intentional. Each entry point now required a pre-approved code tied to emergency use. The interface allowed real-time tracking, expiration controls, and alerts for unauthorized attempts. Claire's old code, built on her birthday, had been disabled. The key fob? Deactivated and mailed back in a padded envelope with no return address. Above the garage keypad, Margaret had mounted a small laminated sign with plain black letters. "This property is monitored. All access logged. Entry by permission only." There was no flourish, just fact. She had also spent that morning with gloves on, sorting through the bins and boxes stacked in the garage's farthest corner. Half the items were Claire's, or claimed by her years ago: baby clothes, books, a broken lamp Margaret had been asked to just hang on to for now. The other half had become ghosts of intention, forgotten decorations, half-repaired furniture, bins marked "donate later." So she did. She loaded the car with everything that had gathered dust and inertia, drove to the nearest Goodwill, and dropped it all off. She didn't take the receipt. The air had felt lighter when she got home. Later, she visited the post office to file a change of address form. All mail previously shared under the duplex's joint listing, utility notices, insurance correspondence, anything Claire had used as a fallback, was now rerouted to a P.O. box in Margaret's name only. There would be no more middle ground. Now, watching the denied access attempt from inside her study, Margaret stood and walked to the front door just as Claire circled to the porch. Her knock was firm, rapid, irritated. Margaret opened it only a few inches. "I need to get Ethan's winter stuff," Claire said, not quite breathless but on edge. "It's in the garage." Margaret didn't step aside. You'll need to call ahead next time, or email, whichever works best for emergencies. Claire blinked. Seriously? I'm just following the label you gave me. Claire's face darkened. This is ridiculous. Margaret's voice was calm, flat. It's architectural. Claire looked like she wanted to say more. Something scathing maybe, or just dramatic enough to cause a scene. But the porch was quiet, and no one was watching. She turned without another word and walked back toward her car, muttering something Margaret couldn't hear. She closed the door gently. That night, Margaret made soup, leek and potato, and read on the couch beneath a wool throw. The house was quiet in the way a courtroom sometimes is just before the verdict. Not tense, just full of weight. She checked her phone once before bed and found a new email. Subject: HOA incident notification. From Wedgeview Community Board. Body: we received a complaint regarding recent access changes at your property. We'd appreciate a brief conversation to ensure community standards are being upheld. Margaret smiled, closed her phone, and walked to her filing cabinet. She pulled out the HOA bylaws she'd printed last spring and placed a post-it on the relevant clause. Homeowner rights under split tenancy and exclusive possession. Then she shut off the light. Her feet silent on the hardwood floor. Her home more hers than it had felt in years. Claire files a complaint through their HOA. She weaponized subtlety. So did I. The HOA call came at 9:04 a.m., just as Margaret was spooning blueberry compote onto her oatmeal. She let it go to voicemail. She knew what it was about before even pressing play. She finished her breakfast slowly, calmly. No rush. When the last bite was gone and her tea was halfway cool, she walked over to the phone, pressed the button, and listened to the practiced voice of someone used to mediating other people's conflicts. Hi, Ms. Whitmore. This is Lisa from the Wedgeview HOA Board. We've received a resident concern regarding what's being described as a sudden and restrictive change in access to your property. We're just looking to clarify the situation and ensure alignment with our community policies. Please give me a call when you have a moment. Thank you. Margaret didn't sigh. She didn't bristle. She just walked to her study and opened the accordion file labeled HOA/legal. Everything was already printed: the severance of joint tenancy, the notice of partition, the confirmation from the county, and the updated occupancy designation. She placed them into a neat manila envelope and walked it over to the community mailbox that afternoon. By 5 p.m., she received a reply: "Thank you for your thorough documentation. No further action needed at this time." She smiled. At 7:42 p.m., Claire sent a text. "Claire, why are you doing this now?" The phrasing was interesting. Not, "Why are you doing this?" which would have implied disagreement, but now, as if timing were the true betrayal. Margaret didn't take long to reply. "Margaret, I'm only responding to how I'm classified." She set the phone down after that. No ellipses danced back. Claire either didn't know what to say or didn't want to say it in writing. That suited Margaret just fine. That night, she took out the will. Her handwriting was steady as she drew a clean line through Claire's name on the primary access clause. Then she rewrote it. Claire Whitmore. Access granted under emergency-only legal thresholds. Contact status and entitlements to be reviewed annually based on behavior and direct relationship patterns. It was not emotional. It was structural. Just like Claire's decision had been, to rename her in her phone, to keep her out of group chats, to pass on the recital invite. Margaret closed the folder and placed it back in the locked drawer of her study. The next day brought a different kind of message. Simple, heartfelt, and not from Claire. "Ethan, miss you, Grandma." The text came with a blurry photo of a pencil drawing, a house with a big oak tree, a yellow cat, and a porch swing. Heron Margaret's throat tightened, not with sadness, but with clarity. He remembered the shape of her life even when his mother refused to name her place in it. She sat down and wrote him back. "Margaret, I miss you too. You draw beautifully. That cat looks like Porter." He sent back a string of smiling emojis and one cat face. Margaret saved the thread. Later that week, while researching succession planning firms, she found a name that made her pause. Legacy Gate. She clicked. The homepage tagline read, "Design what they inherit and what they don't." She liked that. She scheduled a session. No announcement, no warning. This wasn't vengeance. This was estate hygiene. Margaret schedules a trust session with a firm called Legacy Gate. She thought love was automatic. I made it conditional. The woman across the table from Margaret didn't blink at the word conditional. She underlined it, in fact, twice. They were seated in a quiet conference room at Legacy Gate's Durham office, all clean lines and soundproof glass. The air inside smelled faintly of sandalwood and toner. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, insistent and even. Margaret's folder lay open, its tabs labeled Real Property, Brokerage, Healthcare, Contingency. "I want a structure that doesn't rely on sentiment," she said, her tone measured but immovable. "I want logic, and I want proof. Emotion can be faked, behavior can't." The estate attorney, a woman in her early 40s named Marianne, nodded. "We specialize in asset gating, relationship clauses, behavioral benchmarks, and verified access points. We can structure the trust to require documented care interactions. You'll define the terms." Margaret offered a small smile. "Good, because Clare defines nothing anymore." By the end of that afternoon, the Legacy Gate Trust was born. It covered everything. Her half of the duplex, her retirement accounts, her stocks, even the antique silver Margaret inherited from her grandmother and had already earmarked for someone else. Clare was no longer a primary beneficiary. She was placed into a gated class, conditional access only. Her eligibility depended on consistent care-based engagement. Phone calls didn't count unless returned. Visits only qualified if initiated without obligation. No inheritance would pass through if Margaret was ever referred to as needy, difficult, or worse, a burden. That phrase would automatically void her clause. Margaret's voice didn't waver when she told Marianne, "If I'm categorized that way, she receives nothing, not even the furniture." The executor was a man named Harris, a retired probate judge and longtime friend who had once been Margaret's co-counsel in a major guardianship case. He was sharp, fair, and unshakable under pressure. Marianne reviewed the final draft with quiet satisfaction. "You've essentially created a behavioral firewall." "I've created a mirror," Margaret replied. "She'll only get back what she gives." That night, Margaret made a new label for the blue leather journal on her nightstand, Emergency Log. It became her new ritual, not bitter, not obsessive, just exact. Every interaction with Clare went in, the tone of a voicemail, the subtext of a comment during a too-quick lunch, even the performative dinners where Clare smiled for appearances and scrolled beneath the table when Margaret spoke. None of it went undocumented. By mid-April, Clare began calling more, showing up, not too often, but enough to check a box. She'd arrive with pastries Margaret hadn't asked for, comment on how cute the garden looked, then ask vaguely about Margaret's health, always phrased just wrong. "Are you still managing on your own? Need help getting the laundry upstairs yet?" Margaret would smile and nod, but she logged those too, especially that phrasing, "yet." One Sunday afternoon, Clare brought a takeout dinner and tried, awkwardly, to reminisce about childhood trips to the mountains. The memories were hollow, retold like bullet points. Ethan was left at home. Margaret offered her a glass of wine, then silently excused herself mid-meal to go take notes in the emergency log. Clare didn't notice. The next morning, Margaret visited her doctor and signed new healthcare proxy papers. Full authority would go not to Clare, but to Linda Thompson, a former neighbor and dear friend, the kind of woman who still sent handwritten cards on birthdays and brought soup when Margaret had the flu. Linda cried when she was told. Margaret simply replied, "I'm tired of being treated like an obligation by people who wouldn't pass a stranger's empathy test." Linda was also added as a second-tier beneficiary in the Legacy Gate Trust. Clare was notified of none of it. 1 week later, Margaret was brushing porter on the sunroom chaise when her phone rang. It was Clare. Again. This time her voice came through the speaker, thin and laced with frustration. Mom? I'm outside. I think I'm locked out. Margaret didn't move. The cat purred. The smart lock system had been working exactly as programmed. Claire calls from outside the house. I'm locked out. She stood where I used to be, unwelcome and unseen. The knock was sharp, too fast to be polite. Margaret paused mid-stitch, her yarn suspended between two needles, the loop incomplete. The sound had urgency, but not emergency. She sat still, letting the silence between knocks stretch long enough to make its own point. Another knock. Louder. Then the doorbell. Then, "Mom?" Claire's voice cracked. Through the oak-paneled door, thin and breathy. "Mom, can you just open the door?" Margaret set down her knitting gently and stood, her joints protesting in quiet rebellion. She didn't rush. She didn't reach for the knob. From behind the curtain, she saw Claire's outline, shoulders hunched, coat half-zipped, her phone clutched like a lifeline. Her face was flushed, eyes red, but Margaret knew her daughter well enough to read the performance beneath the panic. Claire cried as if they'd never switched places. She used to be the one locked out emotionally, watching life happen through cold glass, birthdays forgotten, plans made without her. Now Claire stood on the same side of the divide, and it was raining lightly, just enough to unsettle without soaking. Margaret didn't open the door. Her phone buzzed. "Claire, let me in. This is getting cruel." Margaret stared at the message for a moment before typing, "Margaret, is this an emergency? Otherwise, I'll see you at the next performance review." She hit send, then turned off notifications. Claire stood outside for another few minutes, pacing now, arms folded tightly across her chest. She kicked at a potted fern, muttered something Margaret couldn't hear, then finally turned and walked briskly down the path toward her car. The porch was silent again. Margaret waited 2 minutes. Then she opened the door just wide enough to retrieve the security feed from the front cam. The footage captured everything, time-stamped, high resolution, no audio needed. She saved the clip, archived it into a folder labeled Incident Log, Claire. She then drafted a brief legal memo on her home computer. Subject: Access Denial Confirmation. To Executor, Legal Advisor. Access Policy Enforcement, no medical emergency observed. Summary: Subject was informed of boundaries. No threat present, no medical duress. Security video attached. It wasn't punitive, it was responsible. She saved it and encrypted the folder. Then she went back upstairs, poured hot water over peppermint leaves, and settled into the worn chair by the window. The yarn waited for her, the texture steady between her fingers. The scent of tea lifted around her, grounding her in the present, not the past they used to pretend was functional. Each stitch she made was measured, like a legal brief written in wool, a contract she kept with herself. By the time the sun had dipped behind the neighbor's fence, the porch was dry again, and Porter had returned to his usual place beside the baseboard heater. At 7:12 p.m., the doorbell didn't ring. Instead, there was a knock on the mailbox slot, forceful, not desperate, controlled. Margaret opened the front door just enough to retrieve a certified envelope resting at her doorstep. She read the label, from Alexander Reeves, attorney at law, on behalf of Clare Reeves. Inside was a formal letter. Subject: Emotional distress. Notification: You have knowingly caused psychological hardship and public embarrassment through intentional exclusion and restriction. This letter serves as documentation of undue emotional suffering. Margaret scanned it twice, her expression flat. She walked to the fireplace, lit it, and watched the letter curl inward on itself, edges blackening like overcooked sugar. Then she returned to her tea and resumed knitting. Claire's husband sends a certified letter. You've caused emotional distress. She accused me of cruelty. I returned the audit. The letter was stiff with self-importance, professionally sealed, signed in heavy blue ink. Margaret read it 3 times without flinching. You have caused undue emotional suffering through calculated isolation and access restriction, it said, its tone somewhere between legalese and theatrical insult. A signature from Claire's husband stamped the bottom like a final sneer. She didn't shred it. She didn't burn it. She filed it in a folder labeled Manipulations, External, then called her lawyer. Daniel picked up on the second ring. "Let me guess," he said before she even spoke. "Certified letter from a man who doesn't understand the weight of a comma?" Margaret's smile barely touched her lips. "He's accusing me of psychological cruelty." There was a brief pause, then Daniel's chair creaked in the background. "Then I suppose we return the courtesy, with exhibits." Within 72 hours, a full counterbrief was dispatched to the firm representing Claire's husband. The front page read, "Emotional distress. Claim, response, and formal audit of documented disengagement attached were over 30 pages of exhibits. Screenshots of unanswered texts, photos of locked doors and posted boundaries, time-stamped security logs, HOA correspondence, redacted sections of the emergency log journal, legal updates to Margaret's will and trust. Claire's name appeared repeatedly, absent from birthdays, missing in medical appointments, silent across holidays. The packet didn't accuse, it simply recorded. A week later, Margaret received no formal reply, but the shift came in tone. Claire's messages, once clipped or defensive, turned soft, syrupy. She sent casual, checking-in texts with emojis, little videos of Ethan playing piano again, even a photo of her holding a store-bought pie captioned, "Remember these?" Margaret saw them for what they were, salvage attempts stitched from guilt. She didn't respond, not with words. Instead, she hung a new framed sign inside the foyer, just beneath the antique mirror Claire used to check her reflection in as a teenager. "This home operates on earned access." A simple sentence, black font, white matte, no embellishments. It stayed there. Meanwhile, Daniel quietly processed a debt separation motion Margaret had drafted months earlier but never filed, until now. It wasn't retaliation. It was clean math. Years ago, Claire's husband had leaned on Margaret's credit to co-sign a bridge loan for a boutique consultancy he said would help families optimize their legacy narratives. The business failed. The payments had stopped. Margaret had covered the final one to protect her score, then locked the file away like a bad memory. Now, with Claire's household angling for moral leverage, Margaret made it official. She filed for debt partition. Under North Carolina law, Claire's husband now bore sole responsibility. Margaret's name was formally severed from the note. Her credit report would be cleared. His wouldn't. Daniel sent confirmation in an envelope Margaret didn't open right away. She already knew what was inside. On a Saturday morning filled with sun and bird song, Margaret poured herself a second cup of coffee, added cinnamon the way she liked, and took her time sweeping the porch. Porter watched from the window, lazy and unconcerned. It was mid-morning when the knock came. Not Claire. A man in a blazer stood holding a clipboard and a folder marked Carolina Living Realty. He smiled. "Hi there, just doing a walkthrough before listing photos. This the Whitmore property?" Margaret's head tilted slightly. "I believe you're mistaken." The realtor blinked, checked his sheet. "This is 108 Marin Lane, right? Claire Reeves submitted the paperwork for staging, says she's relocating within 30 days. Margaret's hands tightened slightly on the broom handle. "Thank you," she said calmly. "There's been a miscommunication. This home isn't hers." The realtor looked sheepish. "I'll follow up." She nodded, waited until he stepped off her porch and rounded the hedges, then closed the door and exhaled. Claire was listing her house, and she hadn't said a word. A realtor knocks. Claire listed her own house. Margaret didn't know. She listed her house. She thought I'd offer mine. The mail wasn't hers. But it arrived in her box anyway, tucked between a garden supply catalog and a flyer for home alarm systems. Margaret recognized the envelope instantly. Standard mortgage correspondence, glossy return label, Claire's name spelled in neat machine print. Her own address sat below it, indifferent. She paused on the porch steps, fingers tightening slightly around the mail stack. Claire hadn't lived here in over a decade. She had her own house, her own life, or so Margaret thought. Inside, the envelope made a soft thump against the marble counter. Margaret boiled water for tea, Earl Grey this time, and left the envelope unopened. Something about its weight felt dishonest. She sat at the kitchen table, sipping slowly, watching Porter stretch himself beneath the radiator with feline detachment. Later that evening, after dinner and one episode of a quiet detective show, Margaret gathered the envelope and two others with Claire's name, slipped them into a manila folder, and wrote across it in blue ink, "Not a resident, return to sender." The next morning, she called the post office. Her voice was calm, clipped. "I'm receiving forwarded mail for someone who no longer lives here. It's not an error. She's trying to establish presence." The woman on the line sounded confused. "Would you like us to reroute it?" Margaret looked out the window at her front yard. Her hydrangeas were blooming again. "No," she said. "Send it back. She has no approved residency at this address." It wasn't until 2 days later that Clare called. Margaret saw her name on the screen, hesitated, then answered. Claire's voice was brittle, the kind of break that follows too many things held in too tightly. "Mom, I know this is sudden, but we sold the house." Margaret didn't respond. She wanted to hear what words Clare would choose next. "There's a delay. The rental we lined up, it fell through. We're in a bit of a jam." Still, Margaret said nothing. She let the tension do the listening. Clare pushed forward. "We just need a place to stay. A few weeks at most. I promise it won't be long. It's just until we close on the new place." Margaret exhaled slowly. "And you're calling me because this is an emergency?" A pause. Claire's voice cracked. "That label was a mistake. You know it." "Was." Margaret's reply was smooth, final. "So is this." Clare didn't hang up, but she didn't reply either. The silence stretched long enough for Margaret to hear the faint hum of traffic through her daughter's line, somewhere in a car, parked or stalled or circling the block. She ended the call. That night, Margaret baked. Not out of spite, but ceremony. She kneaded rosemary focaccia from scratch, the scent filling every inch of the house, clinging to her sleeves and warming the windows. She brushed olive oil on the crust and sprinkled it with sea salt before sliding it into the oven. Porter circled her ankles twice, mewing, then settled near the warm stove. She didn't turn on her phone again until morning. By then, the mail had arrived again. More red envelopes, more redirected appeals. But it was what she found under her welcome mat that brought her hand to her chest. A single folded sheet of white paper, slightly damp from dew. She opened it gently. The drawing was unmistakably Ethan's. Crayons had filled the page with careful lines, a house with a peaked red roof, smoke curling from a chimney, the porch swing drawn with swooping gray arcs. Margaret stood in front, a blue skirt and black glasses. Porter sat next to her. Above the door, written in orange marker, were 5 words. "Grandma's house is safe now." No signature, no message, just memory, redrawn as fact. Margaret brought the picture inside, slipped it into the back of her emergency log, and sat in the window with her tea. She didn't cry. She just turned to a fresh page in her notebook and wrote a single sentence. "Emotional security isn't inherited, it's learned." Outside, the porch was quiet. Inside, her house stayed hers. Claire's son sends a drawing. "Grandma's house is safe. He still sees me, she still doesn't." Margaret opened the door slowly, her hand resting on the old brass handle just long enough to steady herself. The porch creaked under Ethan's sneakers as he stepped forward, arms half raised, uncertain. Then he hugged her, hard. His head barely reached her shoulder, but he gripped her the way children do when they finally feel safe enough to ask for something without using words. "I didn't mean to forget you," he said into her coat. Margaret didn't cry. She just folded him in tighter, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't forget. You were just told to." Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon bread and wood polish. Margaret had prepared everything quietly: his favorite tea, hibiscus with honey, a plate of shortbread, and the small room upstairs that hadn't been touched in months. She led him up the carpeted stairs, hand brushing the banister carved by her grandfather, and opened the door beside the linen closet. The bed had new sheets, navy with white stars, a desk lamp shaped like a rocket, a shelf with a few new books and one of his old puzzles she'd kept even when Clare said to donate the clutter. On the pillow sat a folded piece of cardstock. Ethan read it aloud. "This is always yours. emergency or not. He didn't say anything. He just sat down on the bed, ran his hand over the duvet, and smiled so gently it made Margaret's chest ache. They drank tea in the kitchen, and Ethan told her about his science project, about how the other kids were mean sometimes, but only in little ways, like laughing too fast or whispering when he walked by. Margaret listened the way no one had time to anymore, with her full face, her whole silence. He didn't ask where his mom was. Margaret didn't offer. The absence was understood. That evening, after Ethan was picked up, reluctantly with another hug, Margaret returned to her study. She opened the Legacy Gate file and began drafting what Marianne had called a soft inheritance index. The concept was simple, but untested. Each visit, each genuine act of care, each expression of effort, uncoerced, unrehearsed, would accrue intangible points. Over time, these moments would unlock specific parts of her estate: contributions to education, home ownership support, heirlooms with handwritten letters. Not all inheritances had to come with ceremony. Some could be earned with empathy. She created a grid: date, visit type, emotional quality, follow-through. She labeled it Living Trust Scorecard. Claire's name wasn't listed. Yet, Margaret knew her daughter well enough to expect another grand gesture when things got desperate. But she also knew Ethan, and the boy who drew a picture with the words, "Grandma's house is safe," wouldn't forget this room upstairs, this tea, this version of family. Claire still didn't know, and Margaret had no reason to tell her. 3 days later, she was kneeling in her garden, hands deep in the soil, planting bluebells along the border path, when the phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her palms. The screen showed an unfamiliar number with a New York area code. She answered. "Ms. Whitmore? My name is Talia Green. I'm a journalist with Probate. Journal Weekly, I hope this isn't a bad time." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She stood, silent, letting the birds finish their conversation in the cedar tree above her. "I've been following some recent filings out of Durham," the woman continued. "Your Legacy Gate Trust? The structure's being cited in 2 new petitions. One judge called it quietly precedent-setting. Would you be willing to talk about it? Your approach is becoming case law." Margaret looked toward the upstairs window. The room Ethan had just left was still neat, unused again, but not empty. Her voice was calm, curious. "I think we can talk, but I don't give sound bites." There was a pause. "Good," the journalist said, "because I don't write them." A journalist contacts Margaret. "Your structure is becoming case law." They thought I overreacted. The courts called it precedent. When Margaret first saw her own name cited in a court opinion, it was buried in a footnote. She was reading an article forwarded by her lawyer, a quiet piece from a legal ethics journal that landed in her inbox without fanfare. A North Carolina probate judge had cited the Whitmore Clause while ruling on a contested inheritance in Charlotte. A son had challenged his mother's right to condition assets on contact and care. The judge ruled in favor of the mother. Margaret reread the sentence 3 times. As established in Whitmore v. Reeves, Trust Design 2024, conditional inheritance based on emotional labor reciprocity is not only enforceable, it is equitable. She didn't forward the article to anyone, but she did frame it. Daniel, her lawyer, was less restrained. By the end of the week, he'd filed paperwork to formalize the idea under the name Relational Conditions Trademark, a customizable legal clause that would allow future families to tie inheritance not just to bloodlines, but to behavior. He was already fielding inquiries from estate planners in 4 different states. "Your structure is a revolution," he said during their next call, "and not a noisy one. That's the beauty." Margaret simply replied, "Most revolutions aren't noisy until they're over." By the end of the month, the buzz had trickled out of the legal niche and into broader circulation. Her name appeared in a headline in Clare's local paper. "Retired judge rewrites inheritance with behavior clauses." There was a black and white photo of her from a court session 10 years ago, still sharp-eyed and composed in a navy suit. The article was respectful, if a little breathless. It painted her as a pioneer, a reformer, a woman who used law not to punish but to define value on her own terms. Clare, according to a mutual acquaintance, was mortified, not because of the article, but because neighbors were reading it, because Ethan's piano teacher asked, "Is that your mom in the paper?" Because the HOA newsletter mentioned it in a footnote about their upcoming estate planning night. Still, Clare did not call. No apology arrived, no flowers, not even a text. Margaret wasn't surprised. She was busy. 2 weeks later, she stood in a modest fellowship hall in Durham, facing 27 women in folding chairs. Most of them were over 50. Some had silver hair, some hadn't yet stopped dyeing theirs, and all of them looked tired in the same way, tired of pretending they hadn't noticed their absence from the narratives they built. Margaret spoke without notes. "I was told for years that love is unconditional," she said, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. "That we give without expectation, forgive without cost, and accept being forgotten as part of aging. And I did. For a long time." She paused. "But here's what no one tells you. Boundaries can be a form of love, and inheritance isn't about money. It's about story. I rewrote mine." The women were silent, but their stillness wasn't passive. It was charged. Some sat forward, some clutched pens. One woman near the back wiped her cheek and didn't hide it. Margaret held up the framed copy of her clause. "I call it relational conditions, but you can call it whatever you want. The point is, you don't have to give access to people who treat you like obligation. You don't owe anyone your silence." She closed with a single line. "Sometimes the boundary is the gift." The room stood as one, not out of obligation, but recognition. Afterward, a few women approached her. One wanted help drafting her will, another asked if Margaret would come speak to her quilting group. A third simply said, "Thank you, I thought it was just me." Margaret drove home just after dusk, windows down, the breeze warm on her face. Porter met her at the door, yawning dramatically before winding between her ankles. She fed him, then poured a glass of Pinot Noir and settled into her reading chair by the front window. She was halfway through a memoir when she heard it, a soft knock, not at the front, at the back door. No one used the back door. Margaret set down her glass. Porter stood alert. She walked through the kitchen, her bare feet quiet on the tile. Through the window pane, backlit by the porch light, stood Clare. No suitcase, no phone, no performance, just her, waiting. Clare shows up at the back door. This time, the emergency was real, but I still controlled the access. The phone rang at 5:47 a.m., a time when most news comes like a siren. Margaret stared at the screen. It wasn't Claire's number, it was Alex's. She didn't answer it immediately. She let it ring once more, then picked up, her voice steady. "She fainted," Alex said, breath fast, panicked. "In the kitchen. 1 second she was yelling about invoices, the next she just dropped." Margaret sat straighter in her chair. "Is she breathing?" "Yes, I think." Her eyes opened for a second, but she's slurring her words. "I think it's exhaustion or stress or maybe blood sugar. I don't... Have you called 911? "Yes, they're on the way. But they asked for her emergency contact and I..." His voice wobbled. The kind of crack men allow only when power slips from their grip. "I thought you should know," he finished. Margaret's hand didn't tremble. Her voice was neutral. "Thank you for calling. Send me the hospital name once you have it." That was all she said. When the message came through, she called the hospital, not the family. "This is Margaret Whitmore," she said to the intake nurse. "I understand my daughter Clare Reeves has been admitted. I am not her medical proxy. I won't be arriving. Please list the hospital as her emergency contact." There was a silence on the other end. "Ma'am, are you sure?" "I'm quite sure," Margaret said. "This falls under her classification for me. Emergency only. This isn't my role anymore. The file will reflect that." She hung up. Then she stood slowly. Her hand rested on her chest, not from pain, but from memory. The ache was deep, but not sharp, like scar tissue remembering impact. She didn't change clothes. She didn't pack a bag. She walked into the kitchen, fed Porter, opened the back door to let in the cool breath of morning, and made black tea with lemon. The smell was sharp, clean, the kind of clarity she'd fought to build, sip by quiet sip. By 9 a.m., Daniel had emailed her a copy of the Living Trust scorecard, updated to reflect recent events. The row beside Claire's name read, Visit N.A. Care pending. Emotional integrity incomplete. At 10:16 a.m., Margaret received a call from the hospital social worker. She's awake now. Alert. She asked for you. Margaret responded with the same composure she used in courtrooms. And what is her condition? Stable. Minor concussion from the fall. We're running blood work, but it appears to be stress-related. The silence was deliberate. We will continue her care. The voice added softly. Are you sure you don't want to? She categorized me as emergency only, Margaret said. I've honored that file. She thanked the woman and ended the call. She didn't cry. She walked upstairs, opened the door to Ethan's room, and smoothed the quilt on the bed. The crayon drawing still hung from a magnet on the radiator. Grandma's house is safe. Later that night, as she folded laundry, her phone buzzed once, just once, a text. From Clare. Margaret didn't rush to open it. She didn't freeze either. She finished folding the dish towels, then wiped her hands on the side of her slacks, picked up the phone and read the message. It contained one word. Sorry. No punctuation. No context. Just that. Margaret sat down at the dining room table. The light overhead cast a warm glow across the wood. She placed the phone on the table like it was a fragile item. Glass, maybe. Not broken, but thin. She didn't respond. Instead, she opened her journal and wrote the date in the corner. Then, below it, a single note. Even apologies carry classifications. Claire texts a simple word. Sorry. She apologized, but that doesn't change the locks. The word sorry sat in Margaret's phone like a loose match. Small, maybe harmless, but not meaningless. She read it once at the kitchen table, then again the next morning while stirring her tea. The third time, she didn't read it at all. She just pressed her finger against the screen until the menu popped up. She didn't delete it. She didn't reply either. Instead, she sent a new message, short and deliberate. I accept your words. Access is earned with behavior. Then she set her phone down and began her day. For a while, nothing changed. The locks remained coded. The mailbox remained quiet. Ethan's room stayed untouched but dusted. The same drawing taped to the radiator. The bed always made. Margaret watered her garden, cooked alone, journaled nightly in the emergency log, and held her posture like a boundary. But change arrived, quietly. A card slipped into the mailbox. No return address. Inside, a handwritten note. Thinking of you today. I hope Porter's still bossing the house. Claire. A week later, a grocery delivery showed up, items Margaret hadn't ordered but used anyway. Chamomile tea, fig preserves, a baguette from the French bakery she used to take Claire to on Sundays. Then came the flowers, daffodils in a plain vase. No card this time. Margaret said nothing, wrote nothing. She logged each gesture in the soft inheritance index, marking the column. Attempted consistency. One Saturday morning, a knock came. Not at the front, but the side door. The middle one. Not locked, not unlocked. Claire stood there. She didn't speak right away. Her coat was zipped too high for the temperature, her hands fidgeting inside her sleeves. I brought the photo albums, she said, holding up a tote bag. I thought maybe we could sort them together, but if this is the wrong door, I understand. Margaret opened it. Only that door. She didn't walk her in. Claire sat on the porch steps with her, laying out the albums like puzzle pieces. They didn't talk about what had happened, just names, places, moments that passed for warmth. Claire left an hour later. Margaret didn't offer a hug. The next time Claire visited, it was with Ethan. He bounded into the living room and threw his arms around Margaret like always, eyes lighting up at the cookies on the table. Claire stayed near the doorway, quiet, watching. She didn't ask to stay the night. Margaret didn't offer. Claire continued this way for weeks. Small visits, modest gestures, no announcements. There were no grand apologies, no showy attempts at reconciliation. But the tone changed. Less performance, more presence. Margaret adjusted the smart lock to allow Clare partial access during daylight hours, only to the front entrance, not the garage, not the study. She made no ceremony of it. Clare discovered the change on her third visit when the code she thought wouldn't work did. But the trust remained locked. The legacy gate files were untouched since the hospital incident. Margaret knew that if she were to pass away tomorrow, Clare would still sit outside the gates of inheritance, acknowledged but not welcomed. She spent one full afternoon revisiting the documents, redlining her original notes, tightening phrasing. She added a new clause, her last. Inherited spaces reflect inherited effort. She closed the folder and called Daniel. "It's ready," she said. "It's airtight," he replied. "Nobody gets in without passing the mirror first." That night, Margaret took a long bath. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of wood settling into itself. She wrapped herself in her softest robe and stood by the window, watching the street lamp flicker on. At 9:34 p.m., her phone buzzed. A text. She tapped it open. A photo. Clare's contact page. Her name had changed. It no longer read emergency only. It now said, Mom. Margaret didn't smile. She just closed her eyes, let her hand rest gently over her heart, and whispered a word to herself. Pending. Clare sends a photo. Her phone contact renamed to Mom. She finally changed my name. I changed the locks back. The knock this time was gentle, rhythmic, almost tentative. Margaret stood just behind the door, one hand on the knob, the other curled around a small velvet pouch that fit neatly in her palm. Through the peephole, she saw Clare. Alone. No bag, no phone visible, just her, wearing a navy windbreaker, and that expression Margaret had almost forgotten, the one from childhood apologies. Not the desperate ones, the real ones, the ones earned by time, not panic. Margaret opened the door slowly. Clare looked up, eyes rimmed pink but dry. "Hi," she said, voice quiet. Margaret didn't step aside. She held out the velvet pouch instead. Clare blinked, took it with two hands. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the drawstring open. Inside was a single silver key. On the stem, one word had been engraved. Respected. Clare's breath caught. Margaret didn't speak. Clare did. "You didn't have to," Margaret answered even softer. "Neither did you." Clare nodded, her mouth pulling into the kind of smile that required muscle memory more than joy. A tear slipped free. She didn't wipe it. She stepped forward and hugged her mother. Margaret didn't resist. She didn't lean away. She let the moment sit, heavy and brief, like a door finally unlatched but not yet opened. Then she stepped back and gestured to the side entrance. "Use it," she said. "You've earned it." Clare's hand shook as she slid the key into the lock. It turned without resistance. The second door, untouched for over a year, creaked open. Inside, the house hadn't changed. The floors still smelled faintly of lemon oil and aging wood. The light in the hallway was soft, diffused by linen curtains. Porter meowed from his perch in the window, but didn't move. Clare stepped in, but slowly. She looked around as if entering someone else's memory. Margaret followed. "I made chamomile," she said, already heading for the kitchen. "Unless you still hate it." Clare sat down at the table. "I don't hate it. I think I just hated things that reminded me of you." Margaret's head tilted. "That list was longer than I thought." Clare exhaled, laughing almost. "Yeah, me too." They drank tea in silence, not strained, just necessary. Afterward, Clare walked through the house with unhurried steps. She lingered at the bookshelf, touched the edge of the dining room table. She paused by the radiator, where Ethan's crayon drawings still hung. She pressed 2 fingers against the edge of the paper. "He still says this is the only house he dreams about." Margaret looked up from her cup. "Because it's the only one that gave him space to feel safe." Clare nodded. They didn't talk about the hospital, or the letters, or the silence. Not directly. Margaret walked into her study later that evening, after Clare had gone, without the key, by choice. She opened the fireproof cabinet and pulled out the folder marked Legacy Gate Trust, Final Copy. She made one last amendment to the file, written in her own hand beneath the typed clauses. Access, reinstated, trust, still under review. She slipped the folder back in place, sealed it with the brass latch, and turned to her bookshelf. The journal sat there. Blue leather, gold embossed, emergency log. She ran her palm over it once, then she picked it up, opened the cover, and slowly began tearing out each page. Not rushed, not bitter, just one at a time. Ripping sound, soft, rhythmic, satisfying. When the last page was gone, she fed the fragments into the fireplace, watched the edges curl, watched the ink fade, watched the record burn without regret. Then she sat back in her chair, pulled a blanket across her knees, and stared out the window at the porch light, still glowing. She reached for her tea, still warm. Behind her, Porter purred low and steady. And somewhere down the street, a daughter carried a key she hadn't just been given, but had earned. Some doors stay closed, others open after enough knocking.